Luke sat in an uncomfortable chair in the hospital corridor, the sound of hurried footsteps and muffled conversations around him almost inaudible. The white ceiling light flickered occasionally, and the sterile smell of disinfectant seemed to seep into his skin. He could barely think clearly. The hours he had spent there seemed to stretch into an eternity, and he could do nothing but wait. His mother, Elisa, was in the emergency room, and Luke had no idea what her fate would be. Everything had happened so fast. He closed his eyes, trying not to give in to panic, but the images of that fateful morning came rushing back with full force. It had been just after breakfast, a meal she insisted on preparing as she always did, even though she had seemed exhausted in recent days. They had talked about trivial matters, the usual routine, but then something changed. Elisa placed her hand on her chest, and her face, always pale, turned even whiter. She tried to lean on the kitchen counter, but her legs gave way, and before Luke could react, she collapsed to the floor. "Mom!" Luke shouted, rushing to catch her. Elisa's breathing was short and irregular, and she tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. With trembling fingers, Luke grabbed the phone and dialed the emergency number. He stayed by her side, holding her hand, while waiting for the paramedics. A few minutes later, they arrived, but for Luke, it felt like an eternity. His mother was rushed to the hospital, and he had no choice but to follow her, helpless, watching his world fall apart around him. Now, in the hospital corridor, Luke felt more alone than ever. He clenched his fists, uncertainty gnawing at his mind. His mother had always been his rock, his only family. Elisa was all he knew of the world. She had been overly protective his entire life, as if she feared the world was too dangerous for him. And maybe, in part, he had grown accustomed to it. Luke sighed, a wave of guilt washing over him. Should he have insisted she see a doctor sooner? And now, what would happen to him? The doctor approached, his face impassive. Luke looked at him, hoping for some news, something that would bring relief. But the doctor's gaze was serious. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hayes. Your mother didn't make it. We did what we could, but the attack was too severe." Luke blinked, slowly processing the words. Didn't make it. She was dead. He hadn't had the chance to say goodbye, to say something that mattered. Luke began, his voice weak, but he couldn't finish. The doctor placed a hand on his shoulder, an attempt at comfort, and then walked away, leaving Luke alone with his grief. The emptiness inside him expanded. The funeral was days later, a simple ceremony. Few people attended, just neighbors and a few acquaintances. While everyone went through the formalities, Luke was lost in thought. Elisa had been a protective, overly careful mother. He had grown up under the shadow of her fear, the shadow of something he was never quite sure what it was. Their life had always been so controlled. Elisa had never let him stray far. Since childhood, he had been reminded that the world was dangerous, that he needed to be cautious. She had stopped him from pursuing his own dreams and kept him close, almost as if she were building an invisible barrier between him and the outside world. Now, without her, Luke realized that, even though he was 25 years old, he barely knew what it meant to be independent. He had never been allowed to fly solo. Elisa always said she was protecting him, but from what? He looked at the closed coffin, feeling the overwhelming absence of his mother. For the first time, Luke realized he was completely alone. What would he do now? There was no one left to guide him, and he would have to figure out what it meant to live on his own. After everyone left, Luke stayed alone in the cemetery. The cold wind rustled through the trees, and he felt a strange mix of fear and freedom. Elisa's control over his life was finally gone. But at the same time, it left him disoriented. She had been all he knew, and now, without her, he would have to face the world she had so fiercely shielded him from. Luke lowered his head and took a deep breath. He had no idea where to start. But he knew that, one way or another, he would have to find his path. Deep down, something told him that Elisa hadn't been protecting him from the world for no reason. Maybe there were more secrets than he could imagine. And without his mother to tell him the truth, he would have to find out on his own. 2 days after the funeral, Luke still felt lost. The silence in his home, which had once been comforting, now seemed unbearable. The place where he had spent his entire life now felt cold and empty without his mother's presence. Life, which had always followed a predictable rhythm, had suddenly lost all direction. He was in the living room, absent-mindedly flipping through one of his mother's books, when he heard a knock on the door. Surprised, he slowly got up and went to answer. Upon opening it, he was met with a tall, middle-aged man, well-dressed, with a serious but not threatening expression. "Luke Hayes?" the man asked, his voice professional and courteous. "Yes, that's me," Luke replied, not knowing what to expect. "I'm Daniel Brown, your mother's lawyer. May I come in? We have important matters to discuss." Luke nodded and opened the door, still confused. Daniel entered the house and immediately sensed the heavy atmosphere of grief and loneliness. He sat on the couch and opened his leather briefcase, pulling out a sealed envelope. "Your mother left a letter and a will that I need to present to you. I believe the information contained here will be difficult to process, but it's necessary that you know," Daniel said, handing the envelope to Luke. Luke took the envelope, not understanding what could be so important or complicated. He knew his mother, knew the simple life they led. Was there some life insurance? Some savings she had set aside? He slowly broke the seal and began to read the letter written by Elisa. "Luke, my dear son, I know you are devastated right now, and I deeply regret that I cannot be by your side at this moment. There are things I've hidden from you all these years, always believing I was doing what was best for you. But now, with my passing, you need to know the truth." Luke's heart began to beat faster. What was his mother about to reveal? "Your father, Alexander Hayes, is not dead. In fact, he is one of the wealthiest men in this country, a billionaire. I fled from him before you were born, when I realized the kind of life he wanted for you. Alexander is a powerful, controlling man, and I didn't want you to be shaped by him or the world he created. That's why I raised you apart, protecting you from everything he represents." Luke stopped reading, feeling the ground fall away beneath him. Alexander Hayes? The billionaire? He had seen the name in news reports and business magazines, but he had never made any connection to his own life. How could he be the son of such a man and never have known? Daniel, noticing the shock on Luke's face, intervened. "I know this is a lot to take in, Luke, but your mother was trying to protect you from a reality she believed was dangerous. Alexander is indeed a powerful man, but also a very ruthless one. Elisa believed that if he knew of your existence, he would try to mold you according to his vision, just as he did with the family business." Luke ran his hands through his hair, trying to understand how his entire life could have been based on such a big lie. He had always thought his father had died in an accident, as his mother had said. Now, everything seemed like a grand deception. How could she have hidden something like this? How is it possible I never knew this? My mother. She always said my father had died. That he was an ordinary man. Why hide that he was a billionaire? Luke asked, his voice trembling. Your mother was extremely careful, Daniel replied. When she fled from Alexander, she changed her name, cut all ties with the life she once had, and isolated herself in a small town. Alexander searched for her for a while, but eventually gave up, believing she didn't want to be found. And you, well, she did everything possible to ensure you never suspected the truth. It wasn't easy for her, but Elisa believed it was the only way to keep you safe. Luke felt a mix of anger and confusion. He had always known there was something odd about the way his mother protected him, but he had never imagined it was because of such a huge story. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his past, seemed to disintegrate at that moment. Daniel continued, pulling another document from his briefcase. The issue now, Luke, is that your mother left a will, and you need to understand that there are certain conditions. Although she distanced herself from Alexander, she could never prevent you from being an heir to part of his fortune. Luke's eyes widened. He was an heir to a fortune. How was that even possible? You have the right to a large inheritance, Daniel explained. But there is an important condition. You will need to spend a month living with your father. During that time, you will have the opportunity to get to know who he really is and decide if you want to claim your share. If you refuse to live with him, you forfeit all rights to the inheritance. Luke remained silent, unable to process it all at once. He would have to live with a man he had never met, whom his mother feared so much that she fled and hid her true identity. The idea of facing Alexander, a billionaire with a dark past, seemed surreal. But at the same time, something inside him urged him to accept. Maybe it was the need to understand who his father was. Or perhaps it was the desire to discover why his mother had been so afraid of this man and why she had never allowed him to have a normal life. Luke looked at the document in front of him, feeling the weight of the decision he would have to make. "And if I don't want to?" Luke asked, still trying to comprehend what it all meant. "If you decide not to get closer to Alexander, the inheritance will go to other parties involved in the Hayes family business. But remember, Luke, this is your only chance to discover the truth. Your mother, as much as she protected you, also believed that you needed to know who your father is. The choice is yours." Luke took a deep breath, feeling the pressure mount. He had never wanted to be part of something like this. But at the same time, he knew his life would never be the same. There were so many questions, so many gaps that needed to be filled. And maybe, just maybe, facing the man he had never known was the only way to find the answers. The sun was beginning to set when Luke first saw the imposing Hayes mansion. It was even bigger than he had imagined. The classical architecture rose majestically over vast green fields, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens. The entrance was guarded by tall iron gates, and two large marble columns flanked the main door. It was the kind of place that seemed to belong to another world, a world Luke had never thought he would be part of. As Daniel's car, the lawyer, pulled up to the main entrance, Luke felt the weight of the moment. This was where his father lived. The man his mother had feared so much and fled from for more than 2 decades. Now, he was about to meet him for the first time. "Ready?" Daniel asked, turning off the car. Luke didn't answer immediately. His heart pounded in his chest, and doubt crept into his mind. But he knew there was no turning back now. He needed to know the truth, needed to understand what was really going on in his life. "As ready as I'll ever be," Luke replied, opening the car door and stepping out. They climbed the marble steps, and Daniel rang the doorbell. The door was opened by an older woman, about 50, with gray hair tied in an elegant bun. She had a serious posture, but her eyes were kind. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hayes," the woman said, her voice firm but polite. "I'm Linda, the housekeeper. I'm sure this is an important occasion. I will take you to your father." Luke nodded, trying to hide his nervousness. He followed Linda through the vast entrance hall, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the high walls. The place was luxurious in every detail. Tapestries, large crystal chandeliers, and classical paintings covered the walls. Wealth was evident in every corner. After walking down a long hallway, Linda stopped in front of a large dark wooden door and knocked lightly. "Sir? Your son has arrived," she announced. The door slowly opened, and Luke found himself in a large office, with a huge window offering a panoramic view of the surrounding fields. Behind an immense carved wooden desk sat Alexander Hayes. Luke recognized him from photos, of course. Alexander Hayes, the billionaire magnate who frequently appeared in business magazines and high society events. But seeing him there, in person, was a shock. Alexander was an imposing man in his early 60s, with perfectly combed gray hair and a rigid posture. His blue eyes were cold and calculating, assessing Luke with a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "So, you're my son," Alexander said, his deep, controlled voice devoid of any emotion. Luke felt a mix of anger and discomfort. The words "my son" sounded artificial, as if Alexander were speaking to a stranger. Luke wondered if that's what he was to the man, just a stranger who happened to share his blood. "Seems that way," Luke replied, trying to keep his tone steady. Alexander stood up and walked over to a bookshelf full of old books, pulling out an ancient volume and flipping through it absently, as if Luke's presence was just a formality. your lawyer informed me that you accepted to spend a month here. So, let's get straight to the point, Alexander continued, without bothering to look directly at Luke. I am not the kind of man who wastes time on sentimentality. Your mother and I had our differences. She made decisions that, in my opinion, were wrong. But now you're here, and I expect you to be prepared to integrate into the Hayes family legacy. It won't be easy, but I don't expect you to ask questions about the past. What matters is the future. Luke felt the tension rise. Alexander spoke coldly and distantly, as if the whole life Luke knew, and the absence of this man in it, was irrelevant. What really bothered Luke, however, was the feeling that something important was being left out. What happened between you and my mother? Luke asked, interrupting Alexander's controlled flow. He knew he couldn't bear that tone of indifference much longer. Alexander stopped flipping through the book, closed it slowly, and finally looked directly at Luke. Your mother was a complicated woman, Alexander replied, his voice still cold, but now there was a slight undertone of bitterness. She wanted you to grow up a certain way, away from the influence of my empire. She believed she was protecting you, but in reality, she was limiting you. I, on the other hand, wanted you to have every opportunity to grow up strong, prepared for the real world. That was our difference. She ran away with you because she knew I wouldn't allow you to live a life of mediocrity. Luke felt the anger rise within him. He had always known his mother was overprotective, but he had never imagined her as someone who wanted to keep him limited. To him, she had always been someone who did the best she could, given the circumstances. Maybe she wanted to protect me from you, Luke retorted without thinking. The silence that followed was heavy. Alexander narrowed his eyes, his expression hardening. Watch what you say, boy, Alexander warned, now more severe. You may be my son, but if you're here to challenge me, you won't last long. Luke realized he was treading on dangerous ground. The control Alexander seemed to exert over everyone around him was evident, and he knew this wasn't the time for an open confrontation. Before he could respond, the door opened again, and Robin, a young lawyer on Alexander's team, entered the room with some documents in hand. She stopped when she saw Luke, her eyes curious. Mr. Hayes, sorry to interrupt. I have the documents for review, Robin said, casting a curious glance at Luke. Alexander nodded, but before resuming the conversation, he addressed Luke with a tone that bordered on contempt. You have a month to prove you can be part of this. If you want your share of the inheritance, you'll have to show that you're up to the responsibility. He turned to Robin, signaling that the conversation with Luke was over for the moment. Luke felt a mix of frustration and disbelief. He had never wanted this inheritance. All he wanted were answers, and it seemed he wasn't going to find them anytime soon. The mansion surrounding him felt increasingly oppressive, a reflection of the man standing before him. As he left the office, following Linda, the housekeeper, Luke looked around, trying to understand what his mother had feared so much. The feeling that something was wrong was inescapable. And he knew that, somehow, he would have to uncover the dark secrets his mother had never told him. The following days at the Hayes mansion passed in a mix of boredom and tension for Luke. The opulence around him felt suffocating, and he felt out of place in an environment he had never imagined being part of. The encounter with his father, Alexander, had left him uneasy, as if he was being watched all the time, constantly evaluated. Linda, the housekeeper, was efficient and discreet. She did her work flawlessly, but there was something in her eyes that made Luke believe she knew more about his mother and Alexander's past than she let on. It was almost as if she was waiting for the right moment to reveal something. One morning, while Luke was having breakfast in the vast dining room, he heard soft footsteps behind him. Robin, the young lawyer he had met in his father's office, entered the room with a contained smile. I hope you're adjusting, she said, pulling a chair next to Luke. This place can be intimidating at first. Luke shrugged, still feeling out of place. I think intimidating is the right word. I'm trying to figure out what I'm doing here. Robin laughed softly, a sound that seemed to carry both empathy and irony. Don't worry, we all feel that way when we first get close to the Hayes family. Alexander has a way of making people feel like that. Luke looked at her, intrigued. He knew Robin was close to Alexander in terms of business, but there was something in her tone that suggested she also had her reservations about the patriarch. "And you?" Luke asked, seeking clues. "What do you think of all this?" Robin smiled, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm here to do my job. But if you want my honest opinion, I think you should be careful with what you hope to discover here. There are secrets in this family that might be better left buried." Luke frowned, feeling there was more behind Robin's words. "Secrets? What do you mean by that?" Robin hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether to continue or not. I don't know everything, but I've heard things about your mother's and Alexander's past. Things that were never fully explained. That's why you should be careful. The truth here may not be what it seems." Before Luke could press her for more details, Linda entered the room, carrying a tray of tea. "Breakfast is served, Mr. Hayes," Linda said, her tone always professional, but her gaze lingered on Luke for a second longer than usual. Something in her eyes seemed to confirm what Robin had suggested: there were secrets here. After Robin excused herself to attend to matters in the office, Luke decided to follow an instinct that had been growing since he arrived at the mansion. He needed to understand what exactly his mother feared, what she had hidden all these years. That afternoon, while the house was quiet, Luke went to the garden where Linda was arranging the flowers. He knew that if anyone knew the past of his family, it would be her. Linda had been in the mansion for decades, and her loyalty to Alexander was obvious. But Luke felt that she knew more than she was willing to admit. "Linda," he began, his voice lower than usual, "can I ask you something?" Linda stopped adjusting the flowers and looked at him with a penetrating gaze, as if she knew exactly what was coming. "Of course, Mr. Hayes," she replied calmly. "What really happened between my mother and my father?" Luke asked, feeling the weight of each word. "I know they separated for a reason, and I know it wasn't just about disagreements over how to raise me. My mother was scared. Scared of him. And I need to know why." Linda remained silent for a few seconds, her eyes scanning Luke's face as if assessing whether he was ready for the truth. Then, she sighed deeply. "Elisa was a good woman, but she lived under constant pressure," Linda began, her voice now softer, almost melancholic. "When she first came here, she was in love with Alexander, just as he was with her. But over time, Alexander changed. He became more obsessed with power, with business, and less focused on what really mattered. Your mother began to notice this and feared the environment in which you would grow up." Luke listened intently, his heart racing. "But her fear, it wasn't just about the business environment, was it?" he asked. Linda nodded slowly, looking at the horizon as if memories were being brought back. She began to discover things about Alexander's business, things he was hiding from her. "Elisa didn't want you to grow up in an environment where power and greed were more important than family. She knew that if she stayed, you would end up being shaped by it. So, she did what she thought was best for you. She fled and raised you away from it all. And Alexander? Did he try to find her?" Luke asked. Linda hesitated before answering. "Yes. He searched for her for a long time. But when he realized that Elisa wouldn't come back, he moved on. However, Alexander never forgave your mother for running away. He always believed that he could have raised you the right way, that she limited you, deprived you of being the man he imagined. And now you're here. I can only give you one piece of advice: be careful with what you want to discover. Not everything buried should be unearthed." Luke walked away, his mind filled with new questions. If his mother fled because she discovered something terrible, what exactly was Alexander hiding? Was there something dark in the empire he had built? And what would be the cost of trying to find the truth? That night, Luke lay in bed, unable to rest. Robin and Linda had given him enough hints to know that something was deeply wrong, but no one seemed willing to tell the full story. Staring at the ceiling, he knew he couldn't leave without finding out what his mother had tried to protect for so long. The question now was, Was he ready to face whatever came to light? The morning light filtered into Luke's room, but he hadn't slept much. The revelations from Linda and Robin's subtle warnings swirled in his mind like a storm. He knew he was surrounded by dark secrets, but for now, he had no solid proof. What he knew for certain was that his mother had fled for a good reason, and that his father, Alexander, had something to hide. That day, Luke was called to attend a business meeting with Alexander. The idea of sitting beside his father and witnessing firsthand how the Hayes empire operated was both terrifying and intriguing. He knew this would be the decisive moment, where he could glimpse the world Alexander wanted him to inherit, and discover if it was the same world his mother had tried to protect him from. When Luke went downstairs, Linda was waiting for him in the hall. She had become a sort of quiet guide, offering small pieces of advice and warning glances that only deepened his distrust of his father. "Are you ready for the meeting, Mr. Hayes?" Linda asked, her tone respectful but with a touch of seriousness. Luke nodded. He didn't feel ready, but he knew it was necessary to take this step. As he got into the car that would take him to Hayes Enterprises headquarters, he felt a tight knot in his stomach. Robin was already in the vehicle, which wasn't surprising. She was one of Alexander's closest lawyers, and her role seemed to extend beyond what Luke could imagine. "I hope you're prepared for what you'll find there," Robin said as she adjusted her briefcase on her lap. "Today's meeting isn't just about numbers and contracts. It's a test for you." Luke looked at her, feeling the rising tension. "A test? What kind of test?" Robin gave an enigmatic smile. "Alexander wants to see how you handle tough decisions. He believes that a leader's strength lies in the ability to make unpopular choices. Today, you'll see up close what that means." The drive to the company was long, and the conversation with Robin didn't help ease the weight Luke felt. Upon arrival, he was impressed by the magnitude of the place. Hayes Enterprises headquarters was imposing, a glass tower that reflected the sky, dominating the surrounding landscape. It was a symbol of power and success, but for Luke, the place felt more like a fortress of secrets than a temple of achievements. Upon entering the building, Luke was taken directly to the meeting room. The room was large, with glass walls offering a panoramic view of the city. Alexander was already there, seated at the head of the table, surrounded by executives conversing in low voices. When Luke entered, all eyes turned to him. "Ah, Luke." Finally, Alexander said with a cold smile. "Please, sit. Today we'll see what you're made of." Luke sat, feeling the weight of everyone's gaze on him. The meeting began with presentations of contracts and negotiations over new investments. Throughout the conversation, Alexander directed questions to Luke, as if challenging him to think like him. And slowly, Luke began to realize what Robin had tried to warn him about. Alexander's empire wasn't built solely on legitimate business. The discussion of contracts and partnerships soon turned into something much darker. Alexander and his executives spoke openly about deals that crushed small competitors, price manipulation, and strategies to wipe out anyone who dared to compete. Everything was done subtly, masked by legal and commercial terms, but Luke could see the cruelty behind the facade. At one point, Alexander turned directly to Luke, his eyes gleaming with calculated coldness. "So, Luke, what would you do in this situation?" he asked, as the executives watched attentively. "We're about to acquire a small company that could be a future threat to us. The owner is an experienced man in the market, but he won't stand a chance against our offer. Should we crush him and eliminate the competition, or let him survive to compete with our company?" It was a trap, and Luke knew it. The answer Alexander wanted was clear. He wanted Luke to show the same coldness and ruthlessness that he displayed in business. But Luke couldn't help but think of his mother, of how she had raised him to be different, to avoid the same mistakes Alexander had made. "I think," Luke began, hesitating as everyone in the room waited for his response. "I think there are other ways to handle competition that don't involve destroying someone's life. Maybe a partnership could benefit both." Alexander stared at him for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. The silence in the room was palpable. "A partnership?" Alexander repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. That's what you think we should do? Share power? That's not how the world works, Luke. This man accepted the risks when he entered this market, and now he has to deal with the consequences. Luke felt his blood boil. He already knew what Alexander thought about weakness, but seeing him so willing to destroy people just to maintain control stirred something inside Luke. He realized that if he continued down this path, if he accepted Alexander's rules, he would become someone he despised. Maybe the world doesn't work like that for you, Luke responded, his voice firmer now. But I don't think destroying people is the only way to succeed. Maybe that's why my mother kept me away from this world. The executives around the table exchanged nervous glances, but Alexander didn't seem shaken. On the contrary, he smiled, as if he had finally seen what he wanted. So, that's it? You want to be the good guy in this story? Alexander asked, leaning over the table. You want to tell me you're going to save the world with compassion? That won't get you anywhere. But I'll give you credit, Luke. At least you have the guts to face me. Luke felt a mix of relief and anger. He knew Alexander wouldn't change, but something inside him had shifted. He wasn't willing to bend to that kind of power. When the meeting ended, Luke left the room with Robin by his side. She looked at him with a mixture of respect and concern. You stood up to Alexander, that's more than most people do, she commented. Maybe, but I don't know if I did the right thing, Luke said, shaking his head. What worries me is what else he's hiding. If that's what he does openly, what's hidden must be much worse. Robin stopped, looking directly at Luke. There are a lot of things you still don't know about Alexander. Things that aren't always in the contracts. If you really want to find out what's going on, you'll have to dig deeper than what was said today. Luke felt the weight of Robin's words. He knew the truth was out there, but the question was, would he be ready to face it? In the days following the meeting, Luke couldn't stop thinking about what he had witnessed. The ruthless negotiations, Alexander's lack of scruples, and the utter disregard for the people around him. He wondered if his mother had witnessed something similar in the past and if that was why she had run away. The more Luke thought, the more he felt the need to uncover the truth behind the Hayes empire and the real reason his mother, Elisa, had distanced herself. However, he knew he couldn't do it alone. Robin, with her sharp intelligence and insider knowledge of the company, was his best ally. He needed her, but he also needed more concrete answers from Linda, the housekeeper who seemed to be at the center of all these secrets. One morning, while Alexander was away on a business trip, Luke sought out Robin in her office within the mansion. The place was quiet, except for the distant rustling of trees swaying in the wind. Robin was sitting at her desk, reviewing documents, but she looked up when Luke entered. Luke, she said, her tone a mix of surprise and apprehension. Has something happened? Yes, something is happening, Luke replied, closing the door behind him. There are secrets here. Secrets about my mother and what really happened to make her run. I need your help to find out what Alexander is hiding. Robin set the documents aside, her expression becoming serious. I knew we'd reach this point, she said calmly. There's something you need to know, but to uncover the full truth, we'll need the help of someone who's been here from the beginning. Linda. Luke felt a chill when he heard the housekeeper's name. Linda had always been a silent and mysterious presence in the mansion, but now he knew she held the keys to the secrets of the past. Robin and Luke went to the gardens, where Linda was supervising the gardeners. When she saw them approaching, she stopped what she was doing and watched them with curious but wary eyes. Mrs. Hayes, Luke began, using the most formal tone possible not to arouse suspicion among the staff. We need to talk in private. Linda nodded, sensing the urgency. She led them inside the mansion, to a small private sitting room that was rarely used. As soon as the door closed behind them, Luke went straight to the point. Linda, I need you to tell me the truth. My mother ran away from Alexander for a reason, and I need to know what happened. He's already shown me enough to understand that there's much more than just disagreements over how to raise me. Linda sighed deeply and sat down in an armchair, as if the weight of the years was finally revealing itself. Elisa was a woman of courage. She tried to protect you, Luke, in the only way she knew how, Linda began, her voice low and tense. When your mother came here, Alexander was a different man. But as time passed, the desire for power and control began to consume him. And it wasn't just about business. Alexander became involved in much darker activities than you could imagine. Luke held his breath, his heart racing. What kind of activities? Robin asked, now as invested as Luke. Linda paused, as if carefully weighing her words. He got involved in illegal business, using his fortune and influence to manipulate governments, acquire land illicitly, and control rivals in lethal ways. Elisa discovered this shortly before you were born. She confronted him, but Alexander made her promise to stay silent. Your mother knew that if she stayed, you would be raised in that environment, and she feared that Alexander would shape you to be like him. Luke felt a tight knot in his stomach. His mother's fear wasn't just about Alexander as a father but about him being dragged into the dark side of the Hayes Empire. So she ran, Luke said, almost in a whisper. She isolated herself to keep me away from it. Linda nodded. Yes. And Alexander searched for her for a long time, not out of love, but for control. He never forgave her for escaping. Never forgave her for defying him. When you appeared, he saw the opportunity to finally shape his successor, the heir he had always wanted. But the truth is, your mother feared that by coming back here, you would end up becoming part of this cycle. Now that you're here, Alexander sees this as a chance to continue his legacy, but you have a choice, Luke. You don't have to follow in his footsteps. The revelation left Luke stunned. Everything he had known about his life was suddenly recontextualized. His mother hadn't fled out of cowardice, she had fled to save him from something far more sinister. And if Alexander finds out that I'm investigating? Luke asked, looking at Robin and Linda, his concern growing. Robin exchanged a glance with Linda, and then spoke. He won't like it, that's for sure. But now you have the upper hand. We know what he's hiding, and there are ways to use that against him. We'll have to be careful, but if we play our cards right, you can come out of this not only as the rightful heir but also as someone who can take down the corrupt empire he's built. Linda stood up and placed a gentle hand on Luke's shoulder. Your mother would be proud of you. Don't let Alexander manipulate you. You have something he never had, empathy. And that's what will save you. Luke nodded, feeling a weight on his chest but also a growing resolve. He knew that the final confrontation with Alexander was near. And now he had the information he needed to face him. The final confrontation was approaching, and Luke knew he would have to face Alexander before the truth came to light. The revelations from Linda and Robin had shaken him, but they had also armed him with the knowledge necessary to confront his father. He spent the following days organizing his thoughts, preparing for the battle that was unfolding. However, he knew that Alexander wouldn't be easy to bring down. His father was a powerful man, used to manipulating the world around him to get what he wanted. Luke would need to be careful, choose the right moment, and most importantly, the moment when Alexander was vulnerable. That moment came a few days later when Alexander returned from a business trip. He was in his private library, an immense and luxurious space filled with expensive books and artifacts that displayed the wealth and power of the Hayes family. The afternoon sun shone through the tall windows, casting long shadows over the mahogany furniture. Luke entered the room with firm steps, and Alexander watched him with that cold, calculating gaze that had always unsettled him. "Luke, what brings you here?" Alexander asked, without taking his eyes off the papers he was examining on his desk. Luke closed the door behind him, feeling the tension in the air. "We need to talk," Luke said, keeping his tone controlled but firm. "About what's really going on here." Alexander raised an eyebrow in mild surprise, but his expression remained one of slight boredom. "Going on? If this is about business, I can assure you everything is under control. You don't need to worry about the details. Just keep doing what I asked, and everything will work out." Luke took a step forward, determined not to be intimidated. "This isn't about business, Alexander. It's about the truth. I know what you're hiding. I know about the illegal activities, about how you used your fortune to manipulate governments and destroy competitors. And I know my mother ran away to protect me from all of this." The room fell silent for a moment. Alexander set the papers aside and finally looked directly at Luke. There was something dark in his eyes, a coldness that deepened. "And what do you plan to do with that information, boy?" Alexander asked, his voice lower but filled with threat. Luke felt his heart race but stood his ground. "I'm not going to let you turn me into a version of yourself. I'm not going to continue the legacy you built on lies and destruction. I'm going to expose what you've done. I'll make sure the world knows who you really are." Alexander rose slowly, walking over to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "Your mother was weak, Luke. She couldn't handle the power I built. She tried to run from it, but power always finds a way back. And now you're here, trying to challenge me." He laughed softly, but there was a note of contempt in his voice. "Do you really think you can bring me down? I am Alexander Hayes. I control everything. And you? You're just a boy trying to play grown-up." Luke knew his father would try to intimidate him, but he was ready for it. He looked directly at Alexander, feeling a strength he had never felt before. "Maybe I don't have the same power you do, Alexander. But there's something you don't have, empathy. You never cared about what you destroyed along the way, never cared about people. And that's why you'll fall. I may not have the control you have, but people will see who you really are. And when that happens, everything you've built will crumble." Alexander remained silent, his icy blue eyes fixed on Luke. He knew Luke was serious, but at the same time, he was a man who had never believed he could be defeated. "You're going to challenge me with what, exactly? Gossip? Baseless accusations?" Alexander took a step closer, approaching Luke. "I've faced bigger threats than you, boy. And guess what? I'm still here." It was at that moment that Robin appeared at the door. She was serious, holding an envelope in her hands. Without hesitation, she entered the room and handed the envelope to Luke. "This is the file you asked for," she said, completely ignoring Alexander. Luke took the envelope and, in front of his father, pulled out copies of documents that had been investigated and that proved Alexander's illegal operations. "These are the proofs, Alexander. Proofs that you corrupted governments, destroyed lives, and made fortunes at others' expense. And more than that, these documents are going to the authorities soon. There are already enough people interested in what you've done." Alexander stood still, his eyes scanning the pages quickly. For the first time, Luke saw a slight hesitation on his father's face. It was subtle, but it was there. "You're making a mistake, Luke." "A big mistake," Alexander said, his tone lower now, almost as if he were dealing with a worthy opponent for the first time. Luke stepped back, determined not to let fear take over. "No, Alexander. The mistake was yours. And now you're going to pay for it." The tension in the room was palpable. Alexander knew his position was compromised, and although he had no intention of backing down, he also knew that Luke was determined. Robin, who had remained silent until then, looked at Luke and nodded slightly, showing that she was on his side. "You always had options, Alexander. But you chose the wrong path. Now the world will see who you really are," Luke said, with a firmness that even surprised himself. Alexander, in silence, turned back to the window. The battle was lost for him, and he knew it. But deep down, Luke knew that Alexander wasn't the type to accept defeat easily. Without anything more to say, Luke turned and left the room, followed by Robin. As they walked through the long corridor of the mansion, he felt the weight of the responsibility he now carried. He had faced his father and won. But he knew that victory came with a price. Now, he would have to rebuild his life, honor his mother's legacy, and cleanse the Hayes family name from the cycle of corruption that Alexander had established. Months had passed since the final confrontation with Alexander, and Luke's life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. He now found himself at the helm of Hayes Enterprises, but under new leadership, with a vision different from the one his father had established. The Hayes mansion remained imposing, but now it felt less oppressive, almost as if the weight of the shadows of the past were beginning to fade. Robin remained by Luke's side, as his advisor and partner in every important decision he made. She had proven to be a crucial ally, and together, they had begun restructuring the family business, severing ties with the illicit activities that had sustained Alexander's empire for so long. Luke, sitting at his desk in the company office, looked at the documents in front of him. For the first time in a long time, he felt in control of his own life. He had broken the cycle of corruption, and now he was focused on building a different legacy, one that his mother, Elisa, would have been proud to see. He stood and walked to the window. The sun shone on the horizon, and he felt a sense of peace he had never experienced before. Everything that had happened, the revelations about his father, the secrets, the lies, now seemed like part of a distant past. He had survived the chaos, and now he had the opportunity to make things right. Linda, who had become a sort of maternal figure in his life, entered the office quietly, carrying a tray of tea. She placed the tray on the desk and looked at Luke with a calm smile. "You're doing the right thing, Luke. Your mother would be very proud of you," she said, her voice gentle but full of conviction. Luke nodded, feeling the weight of her words. All he wanted was to honor the sacrifice his mother had made to keep him away from that dark world. Now, he was finally free from Alexander's shadow and could forge his own path. "I just wish she could see what I'm trying to do," Luke replied with a sigh. Linda, always wise, placed her hand on his shoulder. "She sees, Luke. Somehow, I believe she will always be with you." Luke smiled slightly and took a sip of the tea. The warmth of the drink comforted him, bringing a sense of tranquility he knew he hadn't felt since his mother passed away. Later that day, Luke walked through the mansion's corridors, passing the empty rooms that had once seemed so oppressive. He knew there was more work to be done, restructuring the company, clearing the family name, and creating a legacy of integrity. But unlike what Alexander had preached throughout his life, Luke believed that success didn't have to be built on the destruction of others. As he walked, he remembered Robin's words during one of their first meetings, "Not everything buried should be unearthed." However, Luke had done exactly that. He had unearthed the secrets, faced the truth, and now he was beginning to rebuild. And by doing so, he was finally freeing himself from the chains of the past. Robin found him in the corridor, holding some documents in her hands. "The first changes are officially underway," she said with a slight smile. "The old partnerships have been dissolved, and the new contracts are ready. It looks like we're heading in the right direction." Luke looked at her and nodded. "We are, indeed. But this is just the beginning." She accompanied him to the garden, where his mother Elisa's flowers were still blooming. The mansion, which had once seemed a symbol of dark power, was now becoming a place of transformation. Luke knew there was still a long way to go, but now he had something Alexander had never had, a purpose that went beyond greed and control. He wanted to create something lasting, something that reflected who he truly was, not the heir of a corrupted empire, but a man who had found his own way. As he looked out over the horizon, Luke felt a gentle breeze and closed his eyes for a moment, sensing his mother's presence. Finally, he was at peace. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.